It is 8:51, so
Yep.
I don't know who fixed that clock, but thank you. I don't know, one Sunday I looked up there and I'm like, wait, what? All right, so remember the last 2 weeks we've been discussing general revelation. We're probably going to finish general revelation today. And in front of you, you have the notes for the next chapter, Guthrie's notes on special revelation. All right, so remember last week we talked about the arguments against the natural knowledge of God, and Guthrie will interchange terms. So natural knowledge of God is general revelation. Yeah, it's going outside. If there was no such thing as a church, you going outside and saying, my gosh, what a beautiful tree, what a beautiful bird. My gosh, right?
God,
Not
yeah,
even my
yeah.
God, because
Yeah.
they don't believe in God.
Yeah.
And saying all of a sudden, there must be something bigger than me, right? And so, well, Guthrie is now, you're seeing his lean. Remember, we talked last week that Guthrie was a student of Karl Barth, and Barth did not like general revelation. Barth was, as a Reformed theologian, Barth is very strong on special revelation. So when you have one of Barth's students, right, it's just like, you know, if you have a student, I always think about Fraser and how much, the TV show, and how much he loved Sigmund Freud.
Yeah.
And anytime someone made a crack on Sigmund Freud, Fraser would get very upset and very defensive, yeah? So we think about, you know, who are our influences, and yeah, that's the new one. We're not there yet, but we should be hitting that today.
All right.
So last week we ended with point 5, arguments against, and we talked about the scripture verses that initially he said, well, these could be for, but then he said the reason why they might be against is because they're written by people who are already within the faith. Mm-hmm. So if you read the Psalms, if you read New Testament or Genesis and say, look, it talks about the beauties of, well, yeah, well, they're already within the Judeo-Christian faith, so that's how their lens, how they view creation, right? And remember, our worldviews, our lenses are important, because that's what taints how we see things in the world. So what Guthrie is saying with point 5 is that, well, yeah, of course the psalmist is writing about nature. The psalmist is already Jewish. And the psalmist already understands that creation is evidence of his or her creator. So, some guidelines when making a decision. C. 1. We must take seriously all the passages of Scripture that are relevant to this problem, right? So, when we try to figure out special or general revelation, look at the Scriptures, right? Allow the Scriptures to help make your decision, right? It's important, especially if you're coming at it from a Christian worldview. I always say this, that as I don't care whether you're a mainstream Christian or an evangelical Christian or someone who just studies the Bible, your main book is the Bible. So I don't care whether you're liberal or conservative, if you are a Christian, you should know your book. Whether you look at it literally or metaphorically, know your book, right? That is your basis to what you are bringing to the table. Know your book. 2, in agreement with those who deny general revelation and the natural revelation of God, we must take seriously their emphasis on the transcendence of God on the one hand, and on the limitations of human being on the other, right? It's just like the minister who goes to the pulpit. In one hand you have the Bible, in the other hand you have a newspaper, right? You cannot ignore your context, right? That is very important, right? So as Christians, we must understand our limitations. We are limited, every one of us, right? We are cracked vessels. We're able to figure out what we're able to figure out. We must understand our limitations, but also understand the power of God, right? And that's really what we do all the time when we discuss and try to figure out the Bible. and figure out things about God. It is trying to look at it trying to figure things out with our finite minds. I often think about, we try to grasp God with who we are. And imagine a God that was so basic that we were able to figure everything out about God. What kind of God would that be? Not too big.
Probably a popular one.
Probably a popular one.
Most people just kind of stop there and be like,
Probably a
I
popular
made God
one.
and I worship God in my image.
That's it. Yeah, that's a huge problem.
Right.
That's a huge problem. That's
Nice
right.
and bold, huh?
Nice and bold.
God approves of everything I do.
You're in big trouble, but me, on the other hand, I got it covered. And the final point for discussing general revelation, in agreement with those who defend general revelation and the natural knowledge of God, we must take seriously those who insist that the truth of God makes sense. Okay? Any questions before we move further? All right. So Guthrie now has talked a little bit about, or a lot about, the natural revelation of God. So that's the natural side of things. Now we're going to move into the doctrine of special revelation, which, if we remember during the last chapter, Guthrie discussed this as being heavily Bardian. All right, I think I passed out new notes. Does everyone have a copy of the new notes from Guthrie? Okay.
You have one?
So I'm going to read his introduction to this chapter.
That was 12.
It says John Napoli, the Finiac Springs.
Yep,
I think you've moved up.
Oh, there it is. Section
Yeah.
4 up at the top.
this is where I first
Okay.
gave this study. All right. I didn't see God up there, says a cosmonaut who returned to Earth from the heavens. God is dead, says a theologian, speaking for a secular world that thinks it no longer needs God because it has learned to answer all questions and solved all problems without God. Religion is the opiate of the people, said Karl Marx, speaking also for many people since his time, communists and non-communists alike, who have seen that God is often only an excuse for the rich, comfortable, and powerful to maintain the status quo and to persuade or force the poor and exploit to stay in their place. Consider the following pairs of contradictory statements. There is one true and living God. There is no God. Human beings cannot be truly human without God. We can achieve a more just and a more human world without dragging God in as a sop or as a weapon. Look around you. There are evil. There are evidences everywhere of a wise, good, and powerful Heavenly Father. Take another look. A world so filled with suffering, injustice, and evil screams that God does not exist or must be either unable or unwilling to do anything in response. All these statements raise the issue and problems involved in our search for God. They are the issues and problems debated by those who affirm or deny a natural revelation of God in the world and a natural knowledge of God made possible by such a revelation. We have seen in the last chapter that Christians differ among themselves about the result of such a conversation. However, Christians may differ in their answer to the question how and whether we can find God, they agree that in the last analysis we know that God exists because God has found us, not because we have found God, and we know what God is like, not because we have figured out for ourselves what qualifications a divine being must fulfill in order to be truly divine, but because God has revealed God's innermost self by speaking and acting in the world in a special way. How does this special divine self-communication take place? Christians give three answers. It happened and still happens. 1. In history. The history that leads up to, centers in, and follows from a man named Jesus. 2. The book that bears witness to what God said and did and promises to say and do in that history and in that man. 3. In the community of people who through centuries have listened to, proclaimed, and lived by faith in Jesus and the biblical message. In this chapter, we will discuss the meaning of this special revelation and the 3 ways it comes to us. Okay, so Guthrie opens up and gives us sets of contradictory statements, all right? When I was at USF, one of my favorite, I used to love sitting outside and reading and watching my peers. This was mid-90s, and someone was walking by and had a black shirt with white lettering, and in the front it said, "God is dead, Nietzsche." And then as he walked by, in the back of the shirt it said, "Nietzsche is dead, God." And you get, and I just laughed because I thought that was really funny. Everyone's always heard the Nietzsche quote, and but there are these contradictions that we see in our world all the time, and it's hard for as Christians sometimes to defend God, because we feel that we do have to defend God at times, because the world sometimes is a very ugly place, and as Guthrie says, how do you defend when you say, no, God is good? Well, why is there so much hatred and evil and violence in this world? It's not an easy statement, right? And it's something that is not easily defended. So Guthrie says in this chapter, we're going to look at 3 primary things. The revelation as Christians as we know it is
Through Christ.
Christ, right? Jesus. And the way we are given the information about Jesus comes from a book. Which book?
Right.
The Bible. And then he says, then the final piece is the community that has studied this and lived for this since is what?
Still going.
Still going. And what is it called?
Church.
The church. Perfect. Right? So these are the 3 pieces that Guthrie will build up and that we will study with this chapter when looking at special revelation. All right. So we begin with point or Roman numeral 2, God's self-communication. The content of revelation is a person, right? And so remember we discussed in the prior classes that Jesus is not the only time that God revealed God's self to humanity, right? We discussed in other places, right? The burning bush, right? That is revelation of God to humanity, right? It's not just that, Moses took a look and this bush was on fire and he figured out, oh my gosh, this is God. No, God starts talking to Moses. And in a weird way, Moses starts talking back to the bush, right? So this is a revelation of God. God speaking to Job out of the whirlwind, right? This is a revelation of God, right? There are numerous examples, but so Jesus is not the first. Jesus is just the last for us. And for Christians, Jesus is the most clear, right? As Christians, we believe that you pretty much don't get a better revelation of God than God himself coming to earth. That's pretty clear. Yeah. And living with us, for 30, 33 years, eating with us, laughing with us, crying with us, feeling our emotions, becoming friends with us. You pretty much don't get clearer than that. And that's what Christianity believes, right? So the content of revelation is a person. So God reveals God's self in the person of Jesus Christ, or Jesus of Nazareth. He kind of doesn't get Christ as a last name for a while. So Jesus of Nazareth, right? The word Christ, Christos, is a Greek term, loosely translated the anointed, right? The Jewish term is what?
Messiah.
Messiah, right. So remember, if the New Testament is written in common Greek, Koine Greek, so they use terms like Christ, Christos, the anointed one, right, the special one. God confronts us person to person. Think about Jesus' interactions. You know, Jesus just doesn't stand on hilltops and talks, and then goes down, goes to bed, finds another venue, and talks to us from another hilltop. What does Jesus do in between sermons?
He's dealing with
Interact
people.
with-
Yeah. Yeah, he's interacting with people. Yeah. For Jesus, it's all about relationships. It's relationship building. Right? He is building relationships with individuals. As he is creating and preparing this group for the community that he is building, which is the church. Right? So Jesus confronts us person to person. Right? We think about the Gospels. Right? It is one example after another. Whether he is confronting people on a friendly way, on a friendly level. Sometimes people were curious. Sometimes they were faithful. Sometimes they were enemies. But he still confronts each individual or each group of individuals. Israel and Jesus. How does Jesus fit in with Israel?
He's a product
Yeah,
of their culture.
Yeah.
And so,
yeah,
yeah, in a sense, he, follows the standard ways, but he also kind of questions them at the same time.
yeah.
Right.
He's a Jew, most definitely.
Challenges their traditions.
Yeah, but think about even Jesus is challenged with the Syrophoenician woman, right? Here comes a woman who is a Gentile, right? And she asks him of something, and how does he respond to her?
Is that the one he calls a dog? And
Yeah.
stuff?
Not very nicely.
Yeah, I mean he's trying to push her back.
Right.
I'm here for the lost sheep of Israel, right? And there are two different versions in two different of the Gospels. But, in either one, you see Jesus kind of pushing her back. And, he calls her a dog, And so, it's not like a mangy thing roaming the streets. It's more like a house pet. The term kunaros in Greek, like a pet. And Jews did not keep dogs as pets in the ancient world. That was the Gentiles. Our people like keeping dogs as pets. So when she is called a dog, she will understand this reference. Why? Because she's a Gentile, and she understands. It's just like, when we're insulted or when someone is pushing us back, they're going to make sure they use an insult or a literary device that we understand, or else what good is it?
Right.
Right? It just goes over your head. It's just like when you're in school, middle school, and the first time, you do Romeo and Juliet, and I don't know, is it Mercutio that says a pox on both your houses? And, I think that's the term he uses. And I remember being in middle school, and, what is that? And then, the teacher says, that's an insult. There's a reason why after he says that, the Capulets want to come down and you're insulting them. So again, if you don't understand it, it's useless. And so when Jesus says, it would be a waste to throw the master's food on the table, for the dogs, in essence. But her response is what helps jar him when she says, yes, but even the dogs get the crumbs that fall from the master's table. So even Jesus deals with the Jewish worldview in which he was born into. I'm not saying that he is trapped in this, but he is definitely Jewish, as Andy said. He is born Jewish. He is raised Jewish. This is what he knows. So the worldview in which we live in is very powerful. And this is sometimes, it's good for us, but it also limits us, right? It limits us. It doesn't mean that you cannot step out of that, but it means that you have to take a conscientious effort to do so, right? Especially for people who grew up in one area and stayed in that area their whole lives. Sometimes it takes going to a university or moving or going into the military and then going overseas.
Right.
and seeing different cultures, right? So it doesn't mean that you cannot leave this. It means that something typically has to happen for that process to take place, right? Something pushes you, or you take that conscientious step to make a move outwards. So Israel and Jesus is also a product of his worldview, of his people, of his culture.
I think that's a mistake a lot of us as Christians make. Somehow, without realizing that, we're all looking at Jesus came to create a new religion,
Right,
and he didn't.
right.
He was a Jew, a
Yeah.
product of that culture and everything, and he just wanted, is it right to say, make Judaism better? Or
Reform.
I think he wanted to reform it. Alan, I think you're right on target. And I think many Reformed theologians feel the same way. He wanted to reform it, fix it. You know, in his opinion, he saw some ills that he felt that these need to be tweaked and fixed. You know, he doesn't, you're right, he's not looking to create something. He wants to mend something. Martin Luther felt the same way.
Thing, yeah.
Yeah, obviously on a smaller scale. He always considered himself a Roman Catholic, and he wanted to fix. He did not want to make more little churches. He wanted to fix the one church. You know, I often wonder how he felt about, like, if he came back today, Martin, you know, what he would think about the landscape of what the church looks like now. You know, would he be happy with it, or would he be crestfallen and saying, "Oh, this is not what I, this is not what I had envisioned when I began that process." It's interesting. So it's important that we understand that the content of Revelation is a person, Jesus of Nazareth, and this is our revelation, and he is the catalyst, right? He is the one. All right. B, the knowledge that results from revelation is not theoretical, but personal, according to Guthrie. Okay? It's not theoretical, but personal. To know God means to experience God, to have a personal relationship with God. So it's not about theories, right? It's not just about knowledge, right? With Jesus, he encounters many knowledgeable people along the path. He does. These are very intelligent individuals. It's not that they don't have knowledge. They have plenty of it, right? But for Jesus, it's more about experience, right? Remember we said relationship building. Jesus is building relationships. It's about experience. In many ways, it's the difference between a priest and a monk. Think about that. What is a main difference between a priest and a monk? What are priests? They deal with.
They're still in the world. Is that what you're getting at?
Well, no. For the priest, it's more about knowledge,
Okay.
study, and information.
Okay.
For the monk, it's all about experience. It doesn't mean that the monk is not educated. The monks are educated, but the way they work is through experiences. I don't remember who told me this story. It was someone in Macon, that there was not like a seminar, but a get-together, and I want to say it was between Roman Catholics and Buddhist monks and Buddhists. And they got together, and the Buddhist priest and the Roman Catholic priest could not figure a connecting point. They just couldn't do it. You know, too different. You know, this is our system, this is your system, can't work together. The monks come back and say, this is fantastic. Look at all the ways we can connect with each other, right? And so the difference is the monks, who are all about experience, say, no, there are plenty of ways we can connect. Look where we encounter the world together. Look at all of the similarities that we have with each other. So we must remember, for Jesus, the knowledge is personal knowledge. You're able to connect. It's not just head knowledge, right? To know God means to experience God, right? And this is sometimes, a a stumbling block for the mainstream churches, for us, right? Because we love the idea of head knowledge. We all do. We're products of that, right? We love this idea, and it's good. There's nothing wrong with that. But if we limit our experiences, then we are hamstringing ourselves. It's because it is really about the experience, right? So it's important to make sure as Christians we are outside these walls. We might meet here, but our job is outside these walls, right? It's missions. It's getting to know our neighbors. It's doing with others, right? It's getting to know our members, right? It's fellowship, right? It's not just all about worship and studies. It's about sitting down and having a potluck together, right? And so many times things like this are overlooked, but these things are what help build up community. Because you shouldn't be talking when I'm preaching, theoretically, or sleeping, right? So, you really can't get to know someone when you're just sitting and listening to someone, but you can when you're sharing fried chicken, right? So the experience is very important, and it should not be limited, right? So when we think about Jesus, right, he has this amazing knowledge. No one's going to argue that. But think about, he connects with people one-on-one, and it's all about this personal connection that Jesus makes with individuals.
That's why we have fellowship hour.
Yeah, it's extremely important. To me, fellowship is just as important as every other facet of the church. It's hugely important, because for Jesus, it's all about making connections and building these relationships. This is why his people are so upset when he says, hey, soon I'm going to go and I'm going to be handed over, and I'm going to be crucified, and I'm going to die. And it's not just, he's a teacher that everyone likes. He is a teacher, but he is their friend. And they are beside themselves. I mean, Peter goes off. Not because he feels he's losing his best teacher, because he feels like he's going to lose a friend. And you don't make those deep connections without that movement of experiential connection. And Jesus does that. So if Jesus does that, what do you think it means for the church? Same thing.
Yeah, right.
Same thing. Yeah. So much of what Jesus did is leading by example. Right? When Jesus on the first Maundy Thursday, when he kneels down to wash their feet, yeah, and Peter no, Peter's gonna yell at me one day when I see him. Why do you keep using me for an example?
He's guarding the gate.
I know, and I mean it with all respect. But without Peter, we wouldn't have these lessons.
Right.
I mean, so thankfully for Peter. He wouldn't let him do it at first, because it's weird. No, you're the rabbi. You're the teacher.
Right.
We should be washing your feet. And Jesus saying, no, I am teaching you. I'm here to serve, not to be served. I'm teaching you this is what you do for each other. Right? You are to serve each other. Don't look to be served, but look to serve. Right? So Jesus is leading and teaching by example, which confuses his disciples.
Right.
They probably never met a rabbi like this before. I mean, he's a unique individual. So it's all about experience and to have a personal relationship with God. God is your friend, your brother. Right? It's just an odd thing to think about, but these are the relationships that Jesus connects with his followers, and they become very attached to him. Perhaps if he spent enough time in Jerusalem like he did in Galilee, they would not have put him to the cross so fast after the events of Passion Week, right? The cleansing of the temple. I could almost see it in my head as Jesus is, knocking over carts and making the cord and whipping and money clanging and bouncing off stones, and you can see the people of Jerusalem, oh my God, what is this guy doing? But you can almost see his Galileans saying, it's Jesus, Because they know him. You know, they get it. They get it. You know, like they've probably seen him mad too. How many times do they get rebuked by Jesus? Right? They get it. But the people of Jerusalem don't get it. They don't know him like that, like the Galileans do. Right? But the Galileans do know him, and I always get that image in my head of them standing back just saying, yeah, this is Jesus. You wanted him to come down. This is who he is. You know, it's just like, this is who Jesus, because they know him on a level that Jesus built. He built this. He wanted them to know him on a personal level. And they do know him on a personal level. And this is the difference. When the people just get him and they see this, he looks just like a rabble-rouser. But the Galileans, who don't fully understand what he's doing still, don't get me wrong, but they do know his characteristics a little bit better than the people who are now just seeing him for the first time. You know, so they know him personally. Those who know God only theoretically do not know God at all. And here, Guthrie gives us an example. What is the example Guthrie gives us?
Eli's son.
Eli's boys.
Yeah, sure.
And how are Eli's boys?
That's where you lost me.
Oh, Eli was the high priest. And no, well, Samuel comes in.
Yeah.
But Eli had natural sons, right? You know, they're described as like, I'm trying to think of the words, the NRSV is like, not just rascals, but I mean, it's a bad word. Not like a cuss, but the descriptor of them is bad. Remember, they would eat all the fatty pieces of the meat that are
Right.
supposed to be burned.
Mm-hmm.
They would, you know, take from the public, and they were bad. They abused their power, right? So Eli's sons, right, the sons of the high priest, probably understood theoretically about God because they grew up in Eli's house.
Right.
You know, so how do you not know, right? They just kind of follow through the motions, right? Yeah, give me the calf, here's, you know, give me the money, you know, but they definitely were not godly young men, right? In fact, they were so bad that God decided to break off that lineage and saying, you know what, this whole thing, this system is bad. I'm going to bring in Samuel and start a whole new line because of this. Right? So Samuel is brought in, he becomes the high priest, and he's not even part of that Levitical line, right? He's a high priest that was chosen, kind of like Jesus, right? Comes from the tribe of Judah, I believe, and yet he is considered a high priest, right? He's not part of the Levitical line, right? So Eli's sons, theoretically they have this head knowledge about who God is and what their job is, but their hearts are definitely not in this game. Bad kids. So, head knowledge is not good enough. It just is not good enough. It doesn't mean that you're going to do the right things, right? Your hearts have to be in it. It is the same in the New Testament. We must listen again to the passage in Romans. All right, I know we have Bibles. There's a loose one there. You want me to read it? I'll read it. You trust me? All right, and this is in Romans 1:18 through 23. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power, and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of immortal God for the immortal God, for the images made to look like mortal men and birds and animals and reptiles. So even in the New Testament, it says, it's not enough just to say, I know. James. James's epistle, where, he says, you know God, big deal. The devil knows God too. So it's saying it's not enough just to say, I know. Right? It's not enough just to say, I have a knowledge. Right? It's also about the experience and a personal connection to God. Right? It's not just about knowledge. It's not just about knowledge. Knowledge is important, but so is the connectiveness that we have with God. Any questions? All right. C, the knowledge given with revelation is the knowledge of something, or better, someone new and unexpected. Guthrie says, the word revelation itself suggests that something unknown has come to light. When we think of that term revelation, it's like an unraveling, right? A peeling. I love that word that's used in Revelation. It's a peeling. The clouds are peeled, right? We think of the you think when you're opening an orange, right? You peel it, right?
Or
and
an onion, you peel
or an
the
onion.
layers down.
Yeah, the layers, and you get sometimes if you're good at peeling something, right? It kind of curls, and you get that imagery. Right? When God at Jesus' baptism, right, the clouds are they're peeled open to where something is revealed. Right? So revelation gives us this concept that something unknown has now come to the light. Right? Of course, pop culture, we think of the term apocalypse and we think of the term revelation, and now it means something different. It's wild, it's war, it's zombies, it's all of this thrown into this big pot, yeah? And it makes for an exciting movie to watch, but when we think about it scripturally, really revelation means something different, right? Something's revealed to us. We are now seeing something, or we're illumined to something. Right? We now see something, or see something differently, right? And so when we think about that term, a crucified Christ for sinners still seems foolish to the intellectual atheists. Why would something like that make sense to an atheist? They wouldn't. They wouldn't. Even in the ancient world, it was very hard when you think about in the Roman world when Jesus is crucified. Crucifixions, if you are an enemy of the Roman state, not so much a problem. Not so much a problem. The Romans crucified you, well, you must be a friend of mine. You're no friend of the Romans, well, then you're a friend of mine, right? The enemy of thine enemy is my friend, right? Christianity grows really quickly. But in some sectors, when you hear of Christianity, that guy, Christus, he was crucified. He's a criminal, right? It's no different than in our society, they're a felon. They're a convicted felon, right? That's the first thing that runs through our heads, right? And that was the first thing that ran through a lot of Romans' heads. He's a convicted criminal. What do you mean? So, there is a disconnect. There's a disconnect. So we must understand who Jesus was and why a crucified Christ seems foolish. But it seems foolish to an atheist. Yes.
Bill Hicks had a routine where he was like...
Who's Bill Hicks?
He was a comedian in the early 90s who was very smart, but very wrong on a lot of things, in my opinion.
Okay.
But, he was saying that Jesus is like, why would you come back? You're wearing this cross, which is like, if you were going to honor John F. Kennedy, would you wear a gun? You're basically, worshiping the means of his execution. Yes. And he's like, I'm not going back there. But yeah, so he would probably fit into that atheist who finds it foolish.
Right, and it just doesn't make sense. It's not, it's, if you don't understand, or you have no concept, or don't want a concept about God, it really doesn't make sense. And I'm trying to look for Guthrie's piece on this, and how he, here it is. That's 58, it's the one right before it. But yes, it does not make sense. It definitely doesn't. And you're correct. We look at the cross as something different. In the ancient world, the cross did not become a prominent symbol for Christians until the Irish bring it into the system. There were other symbols, like the fish. The Constantinian cross, right, which is the chi and the rho, right? We say the shepherd on the cross. But you're right, it is, it would be no different than if we would wear, electric chairs around our necks. To the Roman world, this is not a good thing. You might know someone who was put on one of those things. It's not a positive, right? It's not a positive, and I don't know why I can't find that subtitle. But anyway, time has escaped, and I will open with that next week, and I will read his section on that. But yes, so that although I think that comedian has a pretty good grasp on it.
Right.
And
I'll
even,
see if I can find it. Because it's. I mean, his execution is great.
I want to say it was Thich Nhat Hanh that said, why don't you try to find a better way to represent your God than the way he died, like a laughing Jesus, or something that he did, like loaves and fishes. And we see a lot of that in our stained glass. Mm-hmm. He did so many wonderful things here. Use something like that. Now, of course, theologically, sure, the cross is a huge part of it. I'm not, negating that or not downplaying the power of the cross and what happened on the cross. Right. But to someone on the outside, why of all symbols is this the one you cling to?
Covered in Dogma, the movie.
Yeah, Dogma's a great movie. Buddy Jesus.
George Carlin, the priest, brings out Buddy Jesus, and to get away from the whole
Dogma.
Jesus.
Dogma is a.
What is that a movie?
It's a great movie.
It's a Kevin Smith movie.
It almost it borders sacrilege.
Oh yeah.
but it really does take a lot of the negativity that Christianity has brought upon itself. Under self-reflection, and saying that these are some of the things that you people do that maybe are not good. Yeah. But it's a great movie. Mm-hmm. It's not meant for kids, but for adults, I think Dogma brings up a lot of challenges that the church. It's just like anything. If there's someone out there who is poking fun or hitting something that's a nerve. Well, maybe there's a reason why it's a nerve to begin with. There's a reason for it. Like if someone's saying, well, the church does this, well, do we? So instead of getting defensive and, how dare you, maybe the response is, okay, let me think about this for a second. Does what you're saying, does it have merit? Right? And Dogma, I think, comes from that direction. And it's a fascinating movie.
Yeah, it definitely brings up.
One thing that I listened recently, there is a mystic priest, and his name is Richard Rohr.
Oh, Richard Rohr is fabulous.
And he said something that I kept repeating to Suhail because it just brought me to a different, to a different way of understanding the crucifixion. He says if we see the crucifixion as a transaction, meaning we gave something and we got something, we're equal.
Right.
We take away the vulnerability of the cross. Because the cross should also mean to us that God loved us so much that God was willing to be vulnerable to that point.
Right.
So it is not a transaction.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way of looking at the cross.
And, because we also can go to the other extreme is, oh, Jesus died for a cross, we bought her at a price,
Yeah, right,
then it's over.
yeah.
We're equal.
It's very wooden to look at it like that.
Yeah, but a lot of
Yeah, yeah,
see it that way when you hear someone say it wasn't a transaction, it was God being so vulnerable and willing to do that.
yeah, yeah. That's one. I think about oh God, the Mel Gibson movie, The Passion, which was, and I like watching action movies and scary movies, and that one is up there. Now I don't think it's supposed to be, but the scene I do love is on the cross when the tear comes down from the heavens. I guess it's a raindrop, but the imagery to me is a tear. And I think that if we think about Jesus and his whole entire ministry is personal and connection and building relationships, then why would we think the cross is not like that? He's doing this because of his love for us.
Right.
Right? And so, yes, and think about our creeds. Jesus is falsely, condemned. He doesn't do these things. He's not, it's not that he's a seditious,
And he wasn't suicidal either.
No.
He didn't do it just,
Right.
Right. He was just willing
yes,
to say
So,
what
yeah.
he needed to say, regardless of the
yeah, yeah. So we're so far away from it that the cross doesn't mean anything to it. We don't see people crucified any longer. Oh, well, at least we don't. But you can see where it would make no sense to someone who is a critic of it. It seems foolish. It does seem foolish. But to us, it's very powerful. It's very powerful. But we can see where it would be foolish for some people because it was foolish to the Romans. They couldn't understand it. What do you mean? Why? He's a criminal. And that's how they viewed him. So if he's a criminal and you follow him, you are, it's just like when your parents say, don't hang out with that guy. He goes to the pool hall. You're going to be associated with him or her, right? And that's how Christians were. They're associated with Jesus. And Jesus was a criminal to the Romans, right? Of course, this takes a few hundred years and it's changed. Just a few hundred years.